Greetings everyone, this is Daniel Gregg speaking. It's been a few days since I did a video, and the topic this time is going to be 1 Corinthians 16:2. Sabbath in 1 Corinthians 16:2. Now you may have never heard of this, and that's because in the normal translations the Sabbath doesn't appear in 1 Corinthians 16:2 because the translators took it out. Okay, so let's read the first paragraph here. We, the faithful to Messiah Yeshua, know that every scripture text is inspired by the Almighty and is profitable for us, so we must pay attention to it. But we must be careful to make sure that we are not deceived by the false translations in our English text. I am sure you are already aware of many false interpretations and also false theological paradigms applied to the text by those rejecting the importance of keeping Yeshua's commandments. You want a picture of yourself in here?
I don't know.
Okay, well you can come and say hi in front of the camera if you want to. That's a nice dress. This is Kira, my youngest daughter. Say hi, smile. Okay. Alrighty. So where was I? I am sure you are already aware of the many false interpretations and also false theological paradigms applied to the text by those rejecting the importance of keeping Yeshua's commandments, who is himself the true Almighty and the everlasting life, who himself gave us Scripture. Yeshua made an appearance on Mount Sinai when the 70 elders of Israel went up the mountains. The text in Exodus 24 says they saw God, and they ate and they drank in his presence. And he did not lay any hand on the sons of Israel. Was that the superstition was that if you saw God, you would die, and which if you saw him in a certain form, you would die, but apparently not when he appeared as the angel of the Lord or Yeshua. So we must also educate ourselves about where the false translations are so that we are not tripped up by them and can recognize what isn't actually Scripture. Alright, so we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 16:2 today. In the ordinary translations, and I will quote from the King James Version here, the text goes like this. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Okay, so if you notice that, it says first day of the week in the King James Version. Okay, but the inspired text, according to the original text, says, down through the first of the Sabbaths, let each one of you be putting aside a savings, whatever he can give from his prosperity, that no collections be made when I may have come. Well, that's from the Good News of Messiah, 1 Corinthians 16:2, as translated straight from the Greek text. Okay. So, let's move on to the interpretation here. The interpretation of the text is not hard. In fact, the background for it is given in Leviticus 23:15. In this verse, there is a command to count 7 Sabbaths after Passover and up to Shavuot, or Pentecost. Okay? So, there are 7 Sabbaths between the Passover and Shavuot, and we're given instructions to count those 7 Sabbaths. First of the Sabbaths, second of the Sabbaths, third of the Sabbaths, and so on to the 7th of the Sabbaths. Alright, so the context here does involve Passover and Shavuot. In 1 Corinthians 16:8, Paul mentions the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, which we call in Hebrew Shavuot. So I'll read you that verse. He says, but I will remain in Ephesus until Shavuot, because a wide door for effective service has been opening to me, and there are many adversaries. Okay, so we know that he mentions the first of the Sabbaths, and then there's an up-and-coming Shavuot. Okay, so can we find a Passover before his statement? And indeed we do. Okay, so the first of the Sabbaths is always between Passover and Shavuot. So Paul sent the letter so that it would arrive for Passover. He states in 1 Corinthians 5:8, he states, a little earlier in the book. Of course, he wrote the book on one occasion. So it says, clean out the old leaven, and we should be celebrating the feast not with the old leaven. He says he wants them to make collections, okay, so he can take it to Jerusalem. He says he will stay in Ephesus for a while and come to them later. Okay, so the year, so I figured out in the chronology books, is the year 56 AD, because in the next year is when he actually makes the trip in 57 AD. Okay, so Paul suggested that he or those whom he approved would transport their gifts to Jerusalem after Shavuot. Okay, and by adopting this plan, he was giving an interpretation of a commandment in Exodus 23:15. A similar commandment is mentioned in Deuteronomy 16:16. All right, so the commandment goes like this. The feast of unleavened bread thou shalt observe 7 days. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread as that I have commanded thee at the appointed time in the month of fresh ears, because in it thou had gone forth from Egypt, and none will see my face empty-handed. Okay, and likewise in Deuteronomy 16:16, no one shall appear before the Lord empty-handed. Okay, so I gave you I think that's a King James translation I gave you. So this is in connection to the pilgrim feasts, and this commandment applies to all three of the pilgrim feasts. That would be Passover, Shavuot, and Tabernacles. Okay, so what it means is by not appearing empty-handed, it means that they should bring a gift when they make the pilgrimage to the feast. Okay, so Paul is following this custom, only he's applying it to the Corinthians in the exile, the Corinthians who've joined Israel, okay, by accepting Messiah Yeshua. All right, the year was 56 AD. Okay, now Paul's plans didn't come out exactly like he wanted because there was a riot in Ephesus. Okay, so this caused a delay of times in Paul's plans. So Paul was delayed until AD 57 in actually transporting the gift. So Paul, after he left Ephesus, he went to Macedonia, and then he went down through Greece and came to Corinth, where he stayed a while with the Corinthians. So during the delay, he had already written 2 Corinthians to them. Okay, and he left when he did arrive in Corinth after writing 2 Corinthians. He left Corinth well before Passover in AD 57 and went back up through Greece and Macedonia until he came to Philippi. And from Philippi, he departed by ship across the northern Aegean Sea to the town of Troas. Okay, and in the town of Troas, there was another meeting, there was a Passover mention, and then immediately after that, he traveled during the days of unleavened bread, and then he met with them on the first of the Sabbaths. And then he went down to Miletus to continue his trip to Jerusalem with the gift of the Corinthians. All right. So when he arrived in Jerusalem, he presented the alms or the gift. So he sailed for Jerusalem, and he was able to reach Jerusalem by the time of the Feast of Pentecost. And after a brief meeting with the Ephesian elders in Miletus. After that, he reached Jerusalem, and he joined some men in a Nazirite vow to disprove the charge that he was not teaching the faithful to circumcise their children. Okay, so this explains the context of the first of the Sabbaths in the passage. And the Greek uses the ordinary word for Sabbath. It's not first day of the week, it's first of the Sabbaths, okay? Um, and the first of the Sabbaths was the first of 7 Sabbaths counted between Passover and Shavuot. Okay, so it fits the context, it fits the season, it connects with the commandment to bring a gift to the pilgrim feast, and this is the reason for Paul giving the instructions. This has nothing to do with Sunday collection in the collection plate for churches. It has nothing to do with any regular meetings on Sunday. In fact, Sunday doesn't even exist in the New Testament. Only the first of the Sabbaths and the Sabbath. And the first of the Sabbaths is a special, particular Sabbath after the Passover. Okay, so now that I've explained the text and you see how it's been changed and what it really says, I will make some remarks on the Greek text. So to try to be the most helpful possible here without getting bogged down in too many details. Okay, the word Sabbaths is in the plural. Okay, so that's Sabbaton in Greek, or it would be Shabbatot in Hebrew. Okay, in other Greek texts, or there is a difference in the Greek manuscripts. In some of them, it's singular, Sabbatu, and in others, it's plural, Sabbaton. Okay, so we either have Sabbath or Sabbaths. Now, I follow the reading plural, Sabbaths, okay, which is according to the Byzantine text space, or what people would call the majority text. Not that the Byzantine text space is always right, but I have textual critical reasons for reading it that way. Okay, so the preposition kata at the beginning of verse 2 literally means down from, or down through. Okay, I'll say a little more about that later, but down through the first of the Sabbaths. Paul is not just asking them to save on the first Sabbath or just for one Sabbath. He's asking them to begin saving then, or starting at that time, down through it and up to Shavuot. Okay, so they are putting aside as much of their savings as they can, or as they want to give during this period of time. All right, so there are many technical details of the Greek idiom here, and also Hebrew idiom, and if you are interested in an exhaustive grammatical analysis, you can acquire my book, On the Resurrection Day of Messiah Yeshua. Okay, but I should simply say that clever and crafty scholars from the institutional church try to exploit everything they think they know to say it isn't so. I am well aware of all of their tricks. All you really need to know is that they teach all the other false doctrines that come from their schools and therefore are disqualified. And also others who teach their false doctrines learned from them and still have to unlearn their lies. You will find this out if you study the history of where they get their ideas from, and it isn't Scripture. Okay, so the fact is, Scripture commands us to count 7 Sabbaths. That is literally what Paul was doing. And upon this basis, he taught the Corinthians. The opposition simply leaves the commandment hanging in the air with no explanation as to how or when it was kept. In fact, it's my experience in any discussion with people who are die-hard convinced that there's no error in the translations and that they haven't been deceived. They don't even want to discuss Leviticus 23:15 or what it means in Hebrews. They run away it, they avoid it, they divert the argument, they talk about everything else and every other diversion, but they don't want to talk about that text because it's obvious proof that there was a commandment to count 7 Sabbaths, and if there was a commandment to do it, then the faithful must have been doing it. Okay, and there it is, right in the New Testament, the counting of Sabbaths. All right, so it's plainly obvious. So now for you Greek and Hebrew students out there, I will highlight a few points. The Greek texts vary between reading kata mian sabbaton and kata mian sabbatou. So I mentioned this before. This is a difference between plural Sabbaths and singular Sabbath, which indicates either day of the Sabbath, or if in the singular, or day of the Sabbaths if in the plural. Either way, the Sabbath is indicated. I prefer the plural reading because it is the same as Matthew 28:1 and Acts 27. Codex Sinaiticus is a century older than Alexandrius and Vaticanus. Okay, so Codex Sinaiticus has the plural reading. Okay, so here I'll put up on the screen an image from this codex, which is labeled Aleph or O1 in the catalogs. And I have 2 lines from Codex Sinaiticus here, screenshotted from the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. All right, so this, by the way, I'll have to put up a link to this article, but it's in here. So in the image, in the first line here, it says here, let's see, kata. Okay, so ignore the first 2 letters. Okay, kata in big capital Greek letters on the first line, starting after the first 2 letters. Kata mian sabbaton. And the letter that looks like a C is actually the sigma. Then you have the beta, beta, alpha. And then on the second line, you have the ending of sabbaton, which is tone. So that would be tau, omega, and nu. And you can see there the nu is written above the line, okay, between the omega and the epsilon. And that's because the corrector put the nu back in. So the first edition of Codex Sinaiticus, so to speak, read sabbato, mian sabbato, okay, but then the corrector wrote in the word nu at the end of sabbaton. That's the N above the line spliced between the omega and the epsilon of the next word. Without the nu, the word would be in the dative case and be singular, and the text would easily translate one day to the Sabbath. But with the nu properly at the end, it would be a genitive plural case and read one day of the Sabbaths. Okay, so a similarly suspicious reading occurs in Matthew 28:1 in Codex Sinaiticus. And here on the 3rd line down, it says, Eis mian sabbato, okay, eothen Miriam a Magdalene. Okay, so that part I read a little bit off the end of the text there. But on the second line, Eis mian sabbato, again, the nu it's not in this text here, but there is a little corrector's line over the omega at the end of sabbato, and it's written over there in the margin. The noon is written, or the nu, is written with, I'm careful not to say the Hebrew letter here, which is noon, but actually noon and nu are related, the same letter, the N sound. Written over in the margin is that the sabbato should end with nu, so it should be sabbaton, okay, which means of the Sabbaths, okay. But without it, it would seem to be a dative, okay. And it might, why did they do this? Okay. So it's a curious reading. Mark 16:2 also has this funny item. It says sabbato, but in this case, there's just a line over the omega indicating that there's a correction to be put in here, but it's not written in the margin, okay? So these are suspicious texts, okay? So, however, observe that the scribe, number 1, wrote sabbato, but a corrector scribe indicated in the margin that nu should be read on the end of sabbaton. The nu is not missing in Luke 24:1, John 21, John 20:19, or Acts 27. So I inspected Codex Sinaiticus to see if the noon was there without the help of a corrector, and yes, it's there in the first edition. The dative reading is obviously an intrusion into the text of possibly an individual book reading that was used in the sources for making Codex Sinaiticus. They may have used more than one manuscript or several manuscripts for several books, or consulted several manuscripts. Okay, so the original edition had Sabbato, but then the corrector said, no, I've consulted these other texts. It's Sabbatone, and so he wrote the noon in the margin. What was the first argument to explain their way around this text? Well, there were several, but one of the most popular arguments was to explain the text as one to the Sabbath. Okay, this argument was suggested by scholars in the past, defending the traditional interpretation, because in Hebrew, in the Mishnah and Dead Sea Scrolls, we run across the idiom one to the Sabbath, two to the Sabbath, and so on, up to the eve of the Sabbath and the Sabbath. Okay, so most importantly, in this idiom, there is no sixth to the Sabbath. Okay, proving conclusively that Sabbath never had the meaning of the word week in the idiom. Rather, the idiom also goes the eve of the Sabbath. The eve of the Sabbath. So without the dative case, the scholars now argue that it means first day of the week, having changed their argument from an earlier argument, one to the Sabbath. The claim that the word Sabbath means week does not correspond to the Hebrew idiom, for which the whole point was to count days to the Sabbath. Okay, so some novices are tripped up by the fact that the Greek word in mion in Greek for one is a cardinal number and not the ordinal number first. Well, literally, one of the Sabbaths. This is due to the fact that in Hebrew, the cardinal number one will often be used to mean the number one item in a series, and this is in fact seen in Genesis 1:5. Okay, where the first day is called day one, or Yom Echad in Hebrew. Okay, it's a cardinal number that's being used there, whereas ordinal numbers are used for the rest of the day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, and so on. Okay, so the novice gets tripped up by this literalism, and then they take one of the Sabbaths in an indefinite sense. That's not correct. Okay, the indefinite sense of one does indeed occur in Greek. For example, one of the days of the Son of Man, so that would be indefinite, one of the days of the Son of Man. But the idiom of our first of the Sabbath sometimes occurs with a definite article, so really it means the number one of the Sabbaths, or the one in order, the one coming in the number one place. Okay, so this is how it was understood. Okay, so also novices are tripped up by the word day, which you may have seen in some translations is in italics. Okay, and have argued, well, that day is somehow illegitimate, but that's not the case. Okay, the Greek word one is inflected in the feminine gender, and the ordinary phrase for Sabbath in Greek is day of the Sabbath, in which day is present and the feminine in gender. So the ordinary phrase, Hebrew, it's having a Hebrew source, Yom HaShabbat. Okay, only the Hebrew pluralized it and said, Hemeraton, Sabbaton. Okay, so they calqued the phrase from the Hebrew, but they pluralized the word Sabbath, so it's day of the Sabbath. So really our phrase is just day of the Sabbath with the word first attached to it, and then the word day is dropped because it's redundant, because the Sabbath day is already a day that you can say first of the Sabbath, okay, or first day of the Sabbath. Okay, so this is explained at length in the Resurrection Day book. Okay, all right, I already read that. Okay, so I have seen both of these errors, namely making too much of the cardinal number and making ado about the missing word day that shouldn't be made. I've seen both these errors trip up the well-meaning faithful in Yeshua, whose hearts are in the right place, and they have noted the Sabbath is meant, but they just don't have all the facts. Okay, That's not to say you can't say as much for those who don't follow Yeshua's commandments, because even if you do give them all the facts, they still won't listen to you. Okay, so please don't fall for this. It just makes you an easy target for the upper crust of institutional scholars to come back with a believable rebuttal. At least one that their side will take comfort in knowing about, even if they're contradicted in many other ways. All right, so do not expect arguments to sway them even if you give them the right answers. Okay, as I was saying, don't expect them to respond to the evidence. I mean, hopefully they would, but the reason I'm doing this presentation is for the faithful in Yeshua, to better educate you on how to respond to people and how to know for yourself what the foundation of the truth is and where to spot the incorrect translation. All right. Okay, for the faithful who hold to his testimony and keep his commandments. As for the opposition, you must realize that the opposition is not so much an individual rebellion or sin as it is a collective sin based on their tradition. Their investment in the tradition and religious and theological narrative that has evolved, and a religious and theological narrative that has evolved and been designed over the centuries to keep them locked into the positions, the same positions of the rebels that started the false traditions or introduced the errors into the institutional church. Okay, so we must realize, we who keep Yeshua's commandments, that most of us had to be knocked off of our horses, like Paul on his way to Damascus, okay, at one time or another, to realize the truth. Okay, so I don't teach total depravity doctrine, but tradition and its interlocking apologists do lead to terminal corruption, and false translations play a part in this. So, or its interlocking apologetics do lead to terminal corruption, and false translations play a part of this. So after a remnant is delivered from this corruption, okay, so God's going to do an interim judgment so that the truth can prosper again. What remains will be destroyed, and only the remnant will be left with the resources of the truth. So the pattern of history is that because of rebellion and terminal corruption, whole empires collapsed, fallen away, and disappeared in favor of more righteous people who weren't so corrupt, who could have ears to hear the truth. Okay, so false translations do not become obvious until you do a word study on the original language and obtain from it the normative meaning of the word and associated grammar. The next step is to observe that the norms do make sense in the context, and that it is the tradition that departs from the norms. So in this case, it's the ordinary meaning of the word Sabbaton is Sabbaths, not week, okay, and it makes sense in the context of between Passover and Pentecost, in the context of the commandment, in the context of it referring to a Sabbath day. The ordinary idiom for the day of Sabbath is embedded in the text. It fits all of the norms, okay, and we could keep expanding out this to the norms of wider chronology and the correct teachings of the faith, okay, it fits those norms too. Okay, so then you can see objectively what the truth is. Okay, so my goal is to show you what these norms are and that they do make sense. Okay, but the craft of the defenders of tradition seems always to be to sweep the truth out of the way and simply restate the tradition based on their authority, which they know people will listen to, because people who are not seeking God don't want to hear any answer that exposes their sin. Okay, a sin of departing from the Sabbath, of departing from the commandments of Yeshua. And not just that, but departing from the proper explanations of of forgiveness and sacrifice, and how Yeshua purges our sin and cleanses us from all unrighteousness. And the whole doctrinal structure has become corrupt. All right. So this is why only a remnant will be delivered from this age. Okay, so in the paper, and I'm not going to put this up on the screen, I've listed some usages of the word kata in the Good News of Messiah. For instance, in Acts 24:12, here's a usage of kata. And neither in the temple nor in the congregations nor besides down through the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. So down through the city itself. Okay, that would be a rendering of kata. Okay, which literally means down in Greek. Okay, so also I put, and I don't think I'll put these up on the screens, but they are in the paper, kata in the Liddell, Scott, and Jones lexicon. Definition A, downwards, with the genitive downwards, with the accusative of motion downwards. Okay, so the extension of kata to time is in the sense that time flows down from a point or toward the future. Okay, so that's the sense we're using kata here. All right, so that's the truth about 1 Corinthians 16:2. It says down through the first of the Sabbaths, the Corinthians should take up a collection so they could be ready to be taken to Jerusalem to fulfill the commandment to send by proxy a gift to Jerusalem so that proxy can appear before them not empty-handed, but with a gift at the temple for the people of Israel. Okay, and this clearly shows that Paul still held the Levitical service and the priesthood in high honor, and he wanted, not only just for the sake of Israel, but for the sake of the Corinthians, to realize this. All right, so thank you for listening. Dan Gregg, over and out.